I first would like to introduce the people that are sharing this recital with me, and I'm so grateful and thankful from the bottom of my heart that they're here to present this great piece. Karen Follingstad will be doing the piano solo in this particular piece, and Professor Karen Follingstad, and Professor Michael Gerdes, the director of orchestra, will be conducting his orchestra, and he said he would go ahead and introduce those people for me.
On the first violin we have Martin Pisco, Jesus Cervantes, Diego Guerra, Jared Chilton, on horn Ken Langsford, bassoon Valerie Kerr, and clarinet Jared Cruz.
Thank you. So what I would like to do this afternoon is have us perform the piece first before I say anything about it, so you get a chance to listen to it and come up with your own conclusions. And then I will do a brief lecture where I will go over the historical background, some of the things that I talk about in my dissertation. And then hopefully we will have time, we will perform it a second time so you can kind of take all of that information and maybe apply it to the handout that I've given you, or if you've chosen one of the full scores, and see if you hear some of the similar things or see some of the similar things that I'm talking about. And then I will have questions after that. Okay? All right?
Alle
like to do is just tell you a little bit of how I kind of came to this topic in the first place. So this came from a personal desire to understand the many complexities of Mozart's unique style, his compositional style, in opera and instrumental music. As a performer, I've often had the privilege of performing in many of his operas, and as an audience member, listening to his operas and his other works, his chamber music, his orchestral works, his piano concerto. And I always realized myself how singularly beautiful his music was, and how diverse and so different from the other composers of this era. I was always curious as to why that was. Why did I find his music so compelling, and why did it seem so different than anybody else that I was listening to at the time? I remembered back in my undergrad, where I first performed this piece for my senior recital at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music, and when I first started studying it and performing it, to me it sounded like a piano concerto movement that happened to have a soprano accompanying along, singing along with the piece. And I thought that was really, really interesting. But of course, it's called an aria, so I thought, oh, that can't be. It's an aria. What's with this strange dialogic interpretation between these two soloists, the piano and the soprano? So I was pretty familiar with the piece as a performer, but had never really got into analyzing it. So I decided to work on this piece because I was in Dr. Ace's seminar class. There he is, hello. Because my committee on the East Coast, where I'm getting my doctorate, said I could thankfully take my last class for my degree, which is my graduate seminar theory class here, because I am here teaching instead of trying to somehow get back to North Carolina. So in this class, I decided to work on this piece, to analyze this piece for a paper that I was writing for Dr. Ace's. And after that, after that I realized, wow, I want to do more work on this piece. I want to analyze it more. I want to investigate it more. And that's kind of how this subject came about. I was compelled to do more research on it. So I did. That document has been submitted, and I'm sure there'll be many revisions, and that is quite fine. I defend that on Friday, and then I get to the busy work of formatting, which is exciting times with Windows Word and all of that. So anyway, what I decided to do with the piece is bring about my theory that Mozart's music translates all of his genres, primarily because he is focusing on the melody and the melodic movements, the modules within his pieces, and he's so driven that way that, in my view, he is changing form without, realizing that maybe he's doing that changing form in order to bring his melodies to every piece of his music. So he's concentrating more on how he can get those melodies through the different parts of his music based on modulation, cadences, how do I return to get to that melody that I love so much in the piece. And to me, that's what this piece is all about. So the objective for my paper was to establish that this piece is kind of a link between piano concerti and operatic aria, with using those techniques. All right, so I will give you my exact thesis. It is my theory that Mozart conceived Kerkel 505 as a crossover piece bridging the genres of piano concerto and opera, as well as the forms of sonata rondo, opera seria, aria, which is also considered to be dramma per musica in this period, ritornello formats. Are we all familiar with the ritornello formats within piano, going back and forth between the soloist and the tutti? Yeah. Furthermore, my paper seeks to prove that Mozart's able to interchange all of his compositional strategies between genres, and that helped him compose this piece, and we'll get to why he composed this piece, specifically for himself and for a soprano. He was able to use all of these techniques to bring these two kind of art forms, or these forms together. Okay, page 2. All right, so some historical background on this piece. So he wrote this in November of 1786, and he wrote it for a specific friend. Her name was Nancy Storace. She was an English soprano who came from London, and she was his first Susanna in Le Nozze di Figaro. Did you have a question? Oh, okay. Yeah, so his first Susanna in Le Nozze di Figaro. So there is some discussion and theories that they were quite close. Who knows what that means? Really, really close friends. He was also very close friends with her brother, Stephen Storace. He went by the British version of their last name. Stephen was a pupil of Mozart and one of his best friends and Nancy's brother. So actually, they had planned to make a trip to London together, the three of them, and Mozart's wife Constanza, to tour, do a concert tour in London and England. Is anybody aware of that Mozart at some point was going to go to England? How do you think his father felt about that? Not so great, right? So it's exactly what happened. So they made plans to do this. He wrote this piece for Nancy to perform in her farewell concert to the Vienna stage. She was a very, very prolific and famous singer at that time. Salieri and Mozart and other composers, Cimarosa, wrote operas for her. She was actually recruited to Franz Joseph II's opera buffa troupe, basically. So she was a very important person to the Vienna stage. So she's having a farewell concert. In theory, Mozart was supposed to go with them when they left for England in February after the concert. And he asked his father Leopold to take care of his two children while he and Constanza kind of set up house in England. And of course, Leopold said no, so he wasn't able to make the trip, surprisingly. So, move on here. So, this seems kind of like a strange story, right? Where is the proof in that? So there are two people, actually there are more than two people, but two people I'm bringing up today who actually have done a lot of research in Mozart's letters, some correspondence with Stephen and the Storaces, and Leopold's letters. So for example, Robert Gutman, in his book Mozart, A Culture Biography, tells us that these plans were actually being made to make this tour to England. And that's further supported by Robert Sperling in Mozart's Letters, Mozart's Life. He's done a new study, came out in 2015, where he's translated a lot of Mozart's letters and correspondences back and forth to kind of come from a different perspective of what was going on in his life. And they both support that they were making this trip to go to London. And actually, Robert Spaethling supports that Leopold, as a ruse, said that he didn't want to take Mozart's children because he was sick. So Mozart ended up not being able to go to the tour. All right, so we can move on to the next page. All right, so that's kind of the historic background of this particular piece. So what's very interesting about this piece, and there are many things, here's the first one. The text is based on the opera Idomeneo, the 1781 version that was premiered in Munich, right? The text is based on that. What's very interesting is that this particular concert, our Kerkel 505, is the second one that he wrote with the same text from Idomeneo. The first one, Kerkel 490, was actually a replacement aria that was put in a revised version of Idomeneo that was premiered in 1786. So the reason he wrote a different piece was because the original person who was singing the character of Idamante and Idomeneo was a castrato. Does everybody know what that is? Yeah. So obviously they don't do that anymore. So when he revised the opera, he wrote the piece for a tenor, and that's why he changed the aria and changed a lot of the music for that particular character because it was now going to be a tenor singing the piece. And so so on a side note, because Mozart is so consumed with these concepts of Idomeneo, a full 5 years after the original production of Idomeneo, in Piano Concerto number 25, in C major, which in my dissertation is a comparison piece. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that today, just a little bit towards the end. But in that particular piano concerto, in the final movement, the third movement, in the Allegretto, the primary theme and the whole opening of that movement is the gavotte ballet music from the opera Idomeneo. Right? So he's writing that at the same time as he's writing this particular version of the concert aria for his friend Nancy Storace. Why was he so obsessed with this concept of idomeneo? So in my research, I discovered a gentleman named Daniel Hertz, who is a Mozartian scholar. He writes a lot about Mozart, and specifically, he's written a lot of things about idomeneo. That seems to be his life work. So in this particular article, Mozart, his father, and idomeneo, in the Musical Times in 1978, he suggests that one of the reasons Mozart writes the way he does, and he's particularly drawn to this opera, is a catharsis for emotional issues, right? So the story of idomeneo is based on the lyric tragedy written by Antoine Danchet, and that is based on a mythological Greek story of Idomeneos and Idomenante about father-son struggles. An overbearing father who wants to control his son's life. In that version, the mythological Greek story, and in the French lyric tragedy, Idomeneo sacrifices his son in order to save his kingdom. Right? So his kingdom doesn't get ruined by the sea monster. In Mozart's version, which is the libretto is by Varasco, they change the ending and make it a happy ending, where Idomeneo actually does not sacrifice his son Idamante, and Idamante gets to marry Ilia, who he loves, and everything ends happy. And Idamante and Idomeneo, they make up, and they have they kind of put their worries aside, and there's redemption. So Daniel Hertz's theory is that he's so drawn to the story because of his personal issues that he was having with his father at the time. So how I apply that to my particular piece, in his other work, Hertz's other work, in Tonality of Motif in Idomeneo, he starts to bring up key areas, which I call key mappings, of the opera Idomeneo. And surprisingly enough, those same key areas, those key mappings, are exactly what's happening in this particular piece, Kerkel 505. So let me go over that kind of quickly. So Hertz specifically focuses on the revised Idomeneo of 1786 that has the replacement aria for Idamante. He also focuses on Ilia's aria, Se il padre perde, the lover's duet between Ilia and Idamante, and the Todes quartet between Idomeneo, Idamante, Ilia, and Elettra, as well as Idomeneo's aria, Popolo a voi l'ultima legge. The reason he's focusing on this part of the opera is to figure out what the key areas are and how they relate to each other. So, for example, number one, Idamante's rondo, Kerkel 490, which this is also a rondo, and we'll talk about that in a second. The key areas go through G minor, A flat major, B flat major, and E flat major for that particular piece, which is exactly the same key mapping that we just heard, including the recitative, in this concert aria. Ilia's aria goes through C minor, A major, E flat major, the Todes quartet, E flat, C minor, and then Idomeneo's aria, they're all after each other in the opera, by the way, is E flat and B flat major. So in this particular piece, Kerkel 505, we have the same key mapping area in this aria. The opening recitative, A flat major, Anch'io mi scordi di te, which you heard, and then it modulates through G minor and kind of goes around here and there. Eventually, it concludes its modulation to B flat major, which is going to be the dominant of the home key of E flat major, which is the aria proper, right? So does that sound familiar to some of the things that was going on in the key area mapping of Idomeneo? So both modulations in this particular piece of C minor modulate back to B flat major, which is the dominant, and they go back to the home key. So we've got G minor, we've got C minor, we've got A flat major, we've got E flat major, we've got B flat major. The only one that's missing is A major, right? So for me, it seems pretty non-coincidental, maybe it was, or maybe Mozart just liked that arrangement of key areas, but it seems pretty, you could surmise that perhaps out of all of the libretti that he could choose, out of all of the stories he could set, he is drawn to this particular story and this particular key area for this aria, perhaps as a way of working out a catharsis because of his disappointment of not going to London on his tour. That's a possibility. I go into a little bit more detail on that in the dissertation, but I kind of want to move forward. So now let's consider the translation of this piece. What's interesting is that Kerkel 490, remember that's the aria for the revised version of Idomeneo 1786. It's hard to keep track of sometimes. It's exactly the same text. The only difference is at the beginning of that aria, the recitative is shared between two different characters, Idamante and Ilia. But in the concert aria version of Kerkel 490, one person sings both characters back and forth. In Kerkel 505, which is what we just performed for you, Idamante is the only person that's speaking, so we don't have that recitative at the beginning. We have Kio mi scordi, which in Kerkel 490 is the second half of the recit going into that aria proper. In that particular piece, Kerkel 490, the obbligato instrument is the violin. In this one, you heard obviously beautifully played by Professor Follingstad. It's the piano, which to our ears, at least to mine, sounds more like a blending of piano concerto and aria because the piano sticks out audibly as a different color that's used in the aria besides the voice. In my dissertation, I go into some discussion about, and we're going to see a little bit here, how to view the soprano in this particular piece. I view the soprano in this particular piece as part of the orchestra, part of the ensemble, part of the wind ensemble, and the piano is actually the real solo voice with the soprano kind of coming in and out in a dialogic, conversation. But to me, it really sounds like the piano is the principal coloring of the solo instrument in this piece. Did you guys think that too? Yeah, it's a very interesting piece, huh? Okay, so in the text, translating the text, Idamante says in the recitative, will I forget you, that I should forget you? In a question, you advise me to give myself to him, and then you want me to live. Ah no, to live thus would be much worse than death. So, him is referring to Idomeneo, because Idamante has been told he's going to be sacrificed at this point. Then he says, he's saying this to Ilia, then he says to Ilia, do not fear, my beloved, my heart forever will be yours. I can no longer endure so much pain. My soul lacks the will to continue. You sigh, O mournful sorrow? Just think what a moment this is. Then he continues, O Dio, O God, I cannot express myself. Barbarous stars, pitiless stars, you heard that in Stelle Padre. Why are you so stern? He's talking about the fate of his destiny to be sacrificed. Fair souls who see my suffering at such a moment, tell me if a faithful heart could suffer such torment. So they're very strong words. And if you consider this particular aria, Kerkel 505, is a concert aria. It is not from the opera Idomeneo, right? The key areas and the text is based on the story of Idomeneo, but the other concert aria, Kerkel 490, that is from Idomeneo. So you ask yourself, why, out of all the choices that Mozart had, and by the way, Del Ponte wrote this text for this aria, Kerkel 505, because he was working with him on Le Notte de Figaro. So why, with all of these resources, was he drawn to this particular story of Idomeneo for this aria that he wrote for his good friend who was leaving, right? So it brings up all kinds of interesting conclusions that we can come up with. So in my dissertation, I kind of go with how the music is structured and the text, because there's just not a lot of concrete evidence to suggest that there was anything more than a professional collaboration between him and Nancy Storace, okay? So I kind of run down 1 through, I believe 1 through 9, why I think that this particular piece might be connected to Idomeneo and might be a catharsis for his emotional content of himself. So he wrote the work in 1786 while he's working with Nancy Storace in Le Notte de Figaro. He's very good friends with the Storace family. Idamante is singing to Ilia in Kerkel 505. The character of Idamante, surprisingly enough, is sung by the soprano. The soprano soloist has the text, right? the piano solo, piano obbligato, is often in duet with the soprano. So the piano is a soloist and also is in conversation as if they're two characters. This is what my dissertation talks about. The soprano is sung by Nancy Starace. The piano is played by Mozart. Remember, he premiered the work with her. In his personal account of this piece, which means his diary, his personal account, he writes, "Für Mademoiselle Starace und mich," which means for Miss Starace and me. He marks in that I'm writing this for her, right? So it's pretty important, and it's not a light piece. There's some real meat to this piece, right? The key mapping area is indicative of what we just kind of talked about in Idomeneo, the opera. And again, why make this choice? So in my dissertation, I kind of surmise the same thing that Daniel Gerdes does, that perhaps this is a catharsis for him to, he's putting his heart on his sleeve, basically, in a public performance for this particular person who is important to him. Okay, so leaving the historic stuff behind, now I'm going to move forward and talk a little bit about the form and the genre of these two styles merging together. So this particular concert aria is considered a rondo. Does everybody know what a rondo is? Yay, good. So what's interesting is that the score is labeled Rondo Andante Allegretto, and also Scena mit Aria, and also Recitative und Aria. So we're hearing both things. It's a rondo, it's an opera aria, it's a scena. What's interesting is that in this time period, in the late 18th century, rondo also can mean a two-tempi piece. Perhaps not rondo form, but a two-tempi piece, which you heard that we did for you today, right? So what I argue in my dissertation is that yes, it's obviously a two-tempi piece. It was indicative of the time. Mozart, Salieri, all of these other composers, they wrote rondos in this style, and they called it a two-tempi piece. Most often it was for an opera aria, but not always. So what I also think that the term rondo can be used as a formulaic term as well, not just the title of a two-tempi piece, and this is why. So I'm going to move on to I think I'm on page 10. Yeah, so the organization of form, I believe, at this time, it's a deconstruction of the Baroque era da capo aria, the ABA form, right? So it's a departure from the earlier opera seria that we've had in the earlier part of the 18th century that Mozart is also composing in as well. And so what I theorize is that Mozart is using this form, and other people are supporting this too, is that he's using this form in order to expand the opera seria format. Because what other operas does he write? What other type of operas does he write? Opera buffa, right? Yeah, and another one called Drama per giocoso, which means drama with jokes. So what he starts to do is breaking down the form and combining drama with comedy in one opera, which is not typically done. He's kind of, the pioneer in that. And so what it seems like he's doing is he's taking rondo, he's expanding the form so he can incorporate serious moments, like you heard in this piece, in his opera buffa, like Le Nozze di Figaro. So examples of those operas that are considered drama and drama that have humor are Idomeneo, Die Entführung aus dem Stradale, Le Nozze di Figaro, Don Giovanni, and Così fan tutte. Right? So what's interesting is that in these particular operas, the serious arias are sung mostly by women. So it's very, very interesting to think about why is that? Why is the woman the serious person in these particular operas where he's expanding these arias? A couple of times it's by some of the male characters like the Count, but it's mostly the female characters, and on top of that, the characters that have some kind of noble background. So it's possible that he is extending this aria form in order to show musically the difference between his comical characters and his serious characters. Does that make sense? Yeah, which I found completely fascinating. So why I think this is also rondo in form, So in Hebekowski and Darcy, do we all know who these gentlemen are, who wrote Elements of Sonata Theory, they define rondo as having two specific features. They include the reoccurrence of the refrain in the tonic key, called the rondo theme, which we clearly heard in this particular piece, separated by contrasting areas called couplets, which are often, but not always, in non-tonic keys. What's interesting about this piece is that we don't leave the home key that much for that long. The home key is E flat major, right? We hear a little bit of C minor here and there, and then we quickly modulate through that back through B flat to E flat, right? What's interesting about this piece, the primary theme, I'm going to throw some terms at you from sonata form because that's also in this piece. The primary theme, which we hear at the beginning of the aria proper, that's that bit right there. That is picked up again in the second half of the aria in the allegretto, but in subdominant. It's not in dominant, and it's not in tonic. So you ask yourself, if this is sonata form theory, how can that be? It's not the same theme, but it uses exactly the same text, exactly the same approach, exactly the same modulations going into the stelle babre to the C minor, exactly the same cadential progression and resolution into the home key. So to me, that is a repeat of the primary theme textually and tonally if you consider how the recitative starts, right? Io vi scordi, we hear in the orchestra, it starts in A flat, which is the subdominant in E flat. So to me, that is orally the repeat of the primary theme, right? So you can argue that, and I'm sure people will when they read my document, that maybe that's not the case. But that's how I hear it. So Malcolm Cole, in his article, The Vogue of the Instrumental Rondo in the late 18th century, he also lays out some principles for rondo that further supports this idea that rondo is kind of a broad, expansive use. And he also brings up the fact that he believes Mozart is using this format in order to expand sonata form so he can incorporate these bigger arias, these more serious arias in his buffo operas. All right, so quickly, the reason I think that these two genres are linked, besides form, is how dramatic they are, right? There's a lot of discussion between James Webster, Martha Feldman, John Irving, and Simon P. Kiefer, who are all Mozartian scholars that study the connections between piano concerti and opera seria. They talk a lot about the dialogue, the dialogic activity between the piano solo and the orchestra in a piano concerto, and the voice solo in an aria in an opera with the orchestra. How the ritornelli is worked out, how the solos are worked out. Because we're running out of time, I'm going to push forward. So basically in my dissertation, I start focusing on how the wind ensemble is used because of how the wind ensembles are used in Mozart's piano concerti. They're really there to highlight, they're very special, and they're there to highlight the entrance of the piano solo more often than not, right? And so what we heard at the beginning of this piece, and we're missing some of our wind ensemble, but that's okay, they played it beautifully, and we get the general idea of the oral thing we're supposed to hear. You heard at the recitative, it's just the voice and strings, correct? And then right before the primary theme comes in, all of a sudden we modulate to the home key and we hear the wind ensemble highlighting the entrance of the piano solo, just as you would hear in his piano concerti. So my dissertation goes into a lot of discussion about that, especially the connections between Köchel 503, which is the piano concerto in C major, that also uses idamineo elements within it. So I talk a lot about the second movement and how the wind ensemble and the piano are in an aria-like format. And then the third movement, where there's a lot of dialogic activity between the piano and the wind ensemble and the orchestra. If you turn to the last page before the conclusion, I kind of go through that with, Okay, so Simon Keefe, he comes up with this theory of something called interlocutors, where he separates the different times that the orchestra is in ritornello with the piano. And he breaks it down, piano and winds and piano, piano and strings, etc. And so what I've done in my dissertation is I've done the same thing with this particular piece, because it does sound like a piano concerto. The only difference is we had two sets at the end. We have voice and piano and voice. And again, for me, the voice is a wind instrument. And so I go into a lot of discussion about that, how we can hear the voice in a way that's abstract textually, where we just hear the tone. And that voice is the wind instrument that is highlighting the piano and in dialogic conversation with the piano. So that's pretty much it. So that's basically the rundown of what my dissertation is about and what I'm trying to prove. If anybody wants to actually read the document, when it's ready, I will let you know when it's been approved and I've done all my revisions and all of that, so you can read more of the stuff that I'm leaving out right now. Do you have any questions about any of that? Yeah, you are.
Have you noticed these like connections to operas and like concertos and stuff with other stuff that he's written? Like
yes, I have, and that's in the dissertation too. Yeah, especially in Abduction from the Seraglio. There's a lot in there. The Aria Martin alla Arten is in pure sonata form, right? And it works back and forth with wind ensemble and the voice as if it's a piano concerto. Yeah, and some of basically his later Viennese piano concerti, they have a lot of these elements, because at that point he's really starting to expand his form. And a lot of theorists consider 503 to be like the penultimate moment where Mozart's decided, enough with form, I'm going to do what I want, and I'm going to use all of my techniques to just make it sound how I want it to sound. For example, that first movement is 23 minutes long. It's the longest first movement in all of his piano concerti. And there's a lot of virtuosic dialogue back and forth between the piano solo and the orchestra as if it's an opera. Yeah, any other questions? Yeah, Karen.
Are there any more of these wonderful pieces with piano?
For this particular one? No, this is it.
This is it.
This is it. This is the only one. Yeah. No, this is the only concert aria with piano. Yeah.
When you were saying that you saw the voice being like a wind instrument?
Yeah.
Did you consider it like
What type?
another instrument?
Yeah,
Or, like,
the oboe. So in my paper, I discussed the similarities between the voice and the oboe, because the oboe, which surprisingly enough, in this orchestration is missing from this particular piece. There is no oboe in this piece. And so, in my view, the soprano is the oboe, because we function, I go into a little bit of pedagogical discussion in my dissertation, and we function how we bring our folds together and sing as if an oboe player is singing through their double reed. And we have a lot of similar qualities in our timbre that the oboe has as well. So I thought it was very interesting how Mozart chose not to use an oboe, because he was scoring for oboe at this time. It's not like, he didn't have that opportunity to use oboe. Yeah?
But I mean, also outside of the wind family,
Yeah.
I know sometimes strings historically have also been used for the voice.
What was that, one more time?
Strings have also historically been used for the voice.
You mean as far as like hearing a vibrato?
As far as like in music, they want to more emotion. They're gonna have the strings.
So they say like, make your violin sing, or something like that. Is that what you mean?
I just know that I've learned that I just know that strings typically can represent the voice. So I didn't know.
It's the vibrato.
Has anyone ever told you to make your violin sing?
Yeah, it's the vibrato that they have to do. I don't play violin, so I'm making it up. That they have to do this way, that we do this way. Does that make sense? So that's how it's indicative to the voice, but it's not a wind instrument, right? The oboe is a wind instrument like we are. And for my dissertation, that's what I'm comparing, is that the colors of the wind instrument in the voice is actually the part of the wind ensemble as if it's in a piano concerto. Cool. Any other questions? Susie?
Was Kirkle 490 intended to be a replacement aria in Idomeneo?
Yes, it was. And it wasn't called Kirkle 490 at that point.
Yeah.
It was just replacement aria. Then later it became a concert aria, and it was given a title as a concert aria, performed separately outside of the revision.
So did he use the piano in that?
No, it's violin. It's a violin obbligato.
Okay, and was this Kerkel 505 ever intended to be put into the opera?
Never, never.
Strictly a concert piece?
It's strictly a concert aria, so it makes you wonder why was he using this,
Yeah.
this source, you know, and the
Uh-huh.
key areas and all that. So it's really fascinating. No, it was strictly a concert aria written for the soprano and himself to perform, and then they left for England. What's really interesting too is that, so historically, they've kept in contact, and they actually succeed in getting Mozart a commission, which was their main goal in 1790, to come to London to premiere Le Nozze di Figaro and to write another opera. And he can't do it because he's very sick at that time and very depressed, and so he turns the commission down. So there is evidence that he's still in contact with this family. So who knows? You know, I mean, there's nothing concrete, so we can make of it what we will, but it's interesting. Any other questions? Do we have time to do it again, or do we not want to? It's cool. Yeah? Do you want to do it again? Me too. All right. So now listen with different ears.